On May 8th, 2025, white smoke rose above the Sistine Chapel and the world paused. The name announced was unexpected. Robert Francis Prevost, an American, a quiet friar, a missionary from Peru. Not a career politician, not a powerful cardinal, but a man shaped by humility, prayer, and service. How did he become Pope Leo XIV, the first American to lead the Catholic Church? This is the story of a journey no one predicted, but everyone now watches. Humble beginnings in Chicago. In the quiet neighborhoods of Southside Chicago, beneath the brick walls and rustling elm trees, a boy was born who would one day walk the halls of the Vatican. His name was Robert Francis Prevost. The year was 1955, and the world was still recovering from the tremors of a great war. But in a modest home, filled with books, music, and prayer, the seeds of a global spiritual journey were quietly taking root. Robert grew up in a household where faith and intellect walked hand in hand. His father, Luis, was a high school teacher, fluent in languages and disciplined in character. His mother, Mildred, a gentle and thoughtful librarian, filled their home with warmth and wisdom. Between the quiet creak of library books and the steady rhythm of daily prayers, young Robert learned early on to value words, silence, and service. The church was not just a place they visited on Sundays. It was part of their daily life. At St. Mary of the Assumption Church, Robert became an altar boy. He held the candlelight during Mass, rang the bells, and watched with quiet awe as the rituals of the church unfolded before him. It was there, standing in the soft golden light of stained glass windows, that his sense of calling began to stir. At home, he was known for his calm nature and intense curiosity. While other children played ball in the alleys, Robert could often be found sitting on the church steps with a book or helping the priests carry sacred vessels. Faith, for him, was not a chore but a mystery to be embraced. The Prevost household welcomed all, neighbors, priests, strangers in need. Hospitality wasn't an act of charity, it was a way of life. These small acts of kindness, repeated day after day, shaped the quiet strength of his character. Even as a boy, Robert showed a rare combination of humility and confidence, of reverence and reason. He attended the minor seminary of the Augustinian order, where his spiritual and academic life deepened. There, he learned Latin, studied scripture, and began to glimpse the global dimension of the church's mission. For Robert, these were not mere subjects. They were the beginning of something sacred, something vast. By the time he turned 22, Robert had already walked a path of discipline, prayer, and purpose. Behind his calm gaze was the mind of a mathematician, the heart of a servant, and the soul of a future shepherd. No one in that small Chicago parish could have known it yet, but the boy who once lit candles at the altar would one day stand beneath the great dome of St. Peter's Basilica, not as a visitor, but as Pope Leo XIV. A scholar of faith and discipline. As Robert Francis Prevost approached the end of his university years, it was becoming clear that his vocation would not be confined to the limits of mathematics alone. Though he graduated from Villanova University in 1977 with a degree in mathematics, a field that demanded clarity, structure, and intellectual rigor, his true calling was of a different nature, one shaped by contemplation, service, and spiritual depth. That same year, he entered the Order of St. Augustine, one of the oldest religious communities in the Catholic Church, founded on the principles of interiority, brotherhood, and the restless pursuit of truth. For Prevost, it was not simply a religious decision. It was a lifelong commitment to live in community, to study, to serve, and to surrender completely to the work of Christ through the Church. In 1978, he professed his initial vows, and by 1981, he had made his solemn profession, binding himself permanently to the Augustinian order. This period was marked by intensive formation, a deepening of theological insight, spiritual discipline, and a growing awareness of the responsibilities that lay ahead. In pursuit of theological and pastoral training, Prevost earned his Master of Divinity degree from the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago in 1982. That same year, he was ordained to the priesthood in Rome, a moment that would define the rest of his life. His ordination was not simply a ceremonial transition, but the formal beginning of a journey that would take him from the academic halls of Europe to the mission fields of South America. Eager to contribute more fully to the governance and legal life of the Church, Prevost advanced his studies in Rome at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, also known as the Angelicum. There, he pursued canon law with the same intellectual intensity he once applied to mathematics. By 1984, he had earned his licentiate in canon law, followed by a doctorate in 1987. This dual formation, academic and spiritual, gave Prevost a unique depth. He was not only a man of prayer and contemplation, but also a precise thinker with a sophisticated understanding of ecclesial structure. He mastered 5 languages: English, Spanish, Italian, French, and Portuguese, an invaluable asset for someone soon to serve the global Church. These years of education were not a retreat from the world, but rather a preparation for it. Prevost was being readied for roles that demanded not only theological clarity, but also pastoral sensitivity, intercultural awareness, and administrative competence. In every sense, he was being quietly forged into a leader, not through ambition, but through discipline and fidelity. Missionary of the Andes. Freshly ordained and intellectually sharpened by years of formation in Rome, Father Robert Prevost did not settle into the comfort of academic halls or administrative posts. Instead, he made a choice that defined the missionary heart of his priesthood. He went to Peru. In 1985, he arrived in the Diocese of Chulucanas, a remote and economically challenged region in northern Peru. Here, among arid hills and humble villages, he embraced the vocation of a true missionary. The transition from the quiet libraries of Rome to the dusty roads of the Andes was stark, yet he made it without hesitation, immersing himself fully in the language, the culture, and the lives of the people. Father Prevost didn't come as a foreigner who taught from a distance. He lived among the poor, listened to their struggles, walked their roads, and shared their tables. He preached in Spanish with clarity and compassion, celebrated the sacraments under open skies, and restored the dignity of many who felt abandoned, not only by society, but by the Church itself. Beyond his pastoral work, he also served in the Church's judicial ministry and theological education. He became director of the local seminary in Trujillo, where he was responsible for the formation of future priests. Under his leadership, the seminary became not just a place of learning, but a school of humanity, a place where young men were taught to serve with integrity, humility, and courage. For more than a decade, Prevost worked tirelessly across Peru, not only as a pastor and educator, but also as a unifying presence in communities fractured by poverty, marginalization, and the scars of political instability. He became known not only for his intellect, but for his availability, always present, always listening, always responding. His fluency in Spanish allowed him to connect with the people at a deeply human level. He did not impose doctrine from above. He lived the gospel among them. This incarnational approach to mission, being with and for the people, earned him the respect not only of Catholics, but of many others across religious and cultural lines. In 1999, the Augustinian Order appointed him as regional superior of their missions in Peru, a recognition of both his leadership and the trust he had earned from the community. Later, in 2001, he was elected Prior General of the entire Order of St. Augustine, a rare distinction for someone whose heart still beat with the humility of a missionary. But before rising to that international role, his years in Peru had already shaped his soul. He had become more than a priest or a scholar. He had become a bridge between worlds, between cultures, and from missionary to global shepherd. By the dawn of the 21st century, Robert Prevost had already distinguished himself as a man of mission, intellect, and unwavering dedication. But the next chapter of his life would place him not just among the people, but at the helm of one of the oldest religious communities in the Catholic Church. In 2001, during the General Chapter of the Order of St. Augustine, held in Rome, Prevost was elected Prior General, the highest office within the Augustinian Order. It was a position of immense responsibility, one that required not only spiritual depth, but global vision. The order, with communities on nearly every continent, needed leadership rooted in tradition, yet responsive to the challenges of a new millennium. In Prevost, they found both. He was re-elected in 2007 for a second 6-year term, an affirmation of the trust and admiration he had earned across the order's international community. As Prior General, he visited Augustinian houses across Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, and North America. He listened to young friars in formation, counseled elderly brothers nearing the end of their earthly pilgrimage, and worked tirelessly to renew the spirit of community, poverty, and mission that had defined the Augustinians since the time of St. Augustine himself. But his leadership was not about administration alone. It was deeply pastoral. Under his guidance, the order strengthened its commitment to justice and peace, education, and service to the marginalized. He emphasized not a rigid institutionalism, but a living spirituality, one that balanced contemplation and action, solitude and service. In 2013, after 12 years of global service to the order, Prevost concluded his time as Prior General. While others may have looked to retire or return to academic work, Prevost remained ready for whatever the Church would ask of him next. That moment came swiftly. Recognizing his pastoral wisdom and international experience, Pope Francis appointed him Apostolic Administrator of the Diocese of Chiclayo in northern Peru in 2014. A year later, he was formally named Bishop of Chiclayo, returning him to the very land where his priesthood had been forged in the dust of mission. As bishop, he was known for walking the streets without entourage, speaking plainly, and defending the dignity of the poor and indigenous. His episcopal motto, Christus est pax nostra, Christ is our peace, was not a slogan, but a mission statement he lived daily. Then, in 2020, as the Church faced complex internal challenges and increasing demands for reform, Pope Francis once again turned to Prevost, this time calling him to Rome to serve as a member of the Vatican's Congregation for Bishops. His insights, shaped not just in chancelleries but in remote parishes and seminary classrooms, offered a rare and valuable perspective. In January 2023, he was appointed prefect of the Dicastery for Bishops, one of the most powerful and sensitive roles in the Roman Curia. In this position, he became responsible for helping the Pope select new bishops around the world, an immense responsibility requiring wisdom, discernment, and profound understanding of the universal Church. And so, the missionary who once carried communion to dirt floor homes in rural Peru now sat at the heart of the Vatican, helping shape the future of Catholic leadership across the globe. From the very first moments of his papacy, Pope Leo XIV made it clear that his leadership would not be defined by spectacle, but by substance. Though his election had surprised many, his message was unmistakably firm. The Church must return to the heart of the gospel: humility, mercy, and truth. In his inaugural homily in St. Peter's Square, before tens of thousands gathered beneath the Roman sun, he preached not with grandeur, but with conviction. He spoke of Christ as the true center of the Church, called bishops and clergy to be shepherds who smell like the sheep, and urged all believers to become builders of bridges, not walls. He quoted both Scripture and St. Augustine, blending theology with a profound human insight that touched believers and skeptics alike. He immediately set a tone of personal simplicity. Rejecting lavish papal apartments, he chose to remain in the modest Vatican guest house, just as Pope Francis had done. His papal garments were understated. He kept the same iron pectoral cross he had worn as bishop. These were not gestures of rebellion, but signs of consistency with a life already shaped by austerity and service. Beyond symbolism, Pope Leo XIV moved quickly on matters of real reform. Within his first 100 days, he convened a special assembly of bishops and theologians to examine how episcopal appointments could be more transparent and better aligned with pastoral needs, an area he had overseen as prefect of the Dicastery for Bishops. He placed special emphasis on appointing bishops who had lived among the poor, ministered in war-torn regions, or served in environments of persecution. His focus on marginalized voices extended further. He launched commissions to re-examine the Church's approach to migration, to healing historical wounds with indigenous communities, and to confronting systemic clericalism. He emphasized listening, truly listening to those who felt voiceless in the Church, the young, the divorced, the disabled, the abused, the disillusioned. But Pope Leo XIV was no mere reformer. He was a man of profound prayer, Mornings began in silence before the Blessed Sacrament. His schedule, though overflowing with meetings and diplomatic audiences, always reserved time for spiritual retreat. He believed that reform must flow from the interior life, not from public pressure. In global matters, he positioned the Church not as a political actor, but as a moral conscience. Whether addressing the United Nations or receiving world leaders, he spoke of peace, climate justice, religious freedom, and the need for human dignity in every sphere, from refugee camps to high-level negotiations. What marked his leadership most was the calm firmness with which he held the Church's center. In a world increasingly polarized politically, culturally, spiritually, Pope Leo XIV refused to be drawn into extremes. He neither yielded to rigid traditionalism nor gave in to pressure for reckless innovation. Instead, he chose the narrow and often painful path of discernment, rooted in the gospel, always seeking what was good, true, and pastoral. In a time when the Church was struggling to be heard amid the noise of the world, his voice, measured, reflective, grounded, emerged as one of moral clarity and compassionate conviction. He did not promise ease, he did not offer instant change, but he offered something more lasting, a vision of the Church as a home for all, a field hospital for the wounded, and a living witness to Christ's peace in a fractured age. From the very first moments of his papacy, Pope Leo XIV made it clear that his leadership would not be defined by spectacle, but by substance. Though his election had surprised many, his message was unmistakably firm. The Church must return to the heart of the gospel: humility, mercy, and truth. In his inaugural homily in St. Peter's Square, before tens of thousands gathered beneath the Roman sun, he preached not with grandeur, but with conviction. He spoke of Christ as the true center of the Church, called bishops and clergy to be shepherds who smell like the sheep, and urged all believers to become builders of bridges, not walls. He quoted both Scripture and St. Augustine, blending theology with a profound human insight that touched believers and skeptics alike. He immediately set a tone of personal simplicity. Rejecting lavish papal apartments, he chose to remain in the modest Vatican guest house, just as Pope Francis had done. His papal garments were understated. He kept the same iron pectoral cross he had worn as bishop. These were not gestures of rebellion, but signs of consistency with a life already shaped by austerity and service. Beyond symbolism, Pope Leo XIV moved quickly on matters of real reform. Within his first 100 days, he convened a special assembly of bishops and theologians to examine how episcopal appointments could be more transparent and better aligned with pastoral needs, an area he had overseen as prefect of the dicastery for bishops. He placed special emphasis on appointing bishops who had lived among the poor, ministered in war-torn regions, or served in environments of persecution. His focus on marginalized voices extended further. He launched commissions to re-examine the Church's approach to migration, to healing historical wounds with indigenous communities, and to confronting systemic clericalism. He emphasized listening, truly listening, to those who felt voiceless in the Church: the young, the divorced, the disabled, the abused, the disillusioned. But Pope Leo XIV was no mere reformer. He was a man of profound prayer. Mornings began in silence before the Blessed Sacrament. His schedule, though overflowing with meetings and diplomatic audiences, always reserved time for spiritual retreat. He believed that reform must flow from the interior life, not from public pressure. In global matters, he positioned the Church not as a political actor, but as a moral conscience. Whether addressing the United Nations or receiving world leaders, he spoke of peace, climate justice, religious freedom, and the need for human dignity in every sphere, from refugee camps to high-level negotiations. What marked his leadership most was the calm firmness with which he held the Church's center. In a world increasingly polarized, politically, culturally, spiritually, Pope Leo XIV refused to be drawn into extremes. He neither yielded to rigid traditionalism nor gave in to pressure for reckless innovation. Instead, he chose the narrow and often painful path of discernment, rooted in the gospel, always seeking what was good, true, and pastoral. In a time when the Church was struggling to be heard amid the noise of the world, his voice, measured, reflective, grounded, emerged as one of moral clarity and compassionate conviction. He did not promise ease, he did not offer instant change, but he offered something more lasting, a vision of the Church as a home for all, a field hospital for the wounded, and a living witness to Christ's peace in a fractured age. Legacy in the making. As the early years of Pope Leo XIV's papacy unfolded, it became increasingly evident that his leadership would not merely be transitional, it was transformational. Though still in its beginning, his pontificate had already begun shaping the future of the Catholic Church in ways that were both bold and deeply rooted in its ancient mission. In every decision, Pope Leo XIV balanced vision with restraint, change with continuity. His approach was pastoral before political, deeply attentive to the wounds of the modern world. He was not interested in dramatic declarations or headline-grabbing gestures. Instead, he led with the steady wisdom of one who had walked with the poor, studied with the thoughtful, and prayed with the faithful for decades before stepping into the role of Supreme Pontiff. Under his guidance, the Church saw a renewed emphasis on synodality, not as a vague ideal, but as a concrete method of listening, dialoguing, and discerning. Local churches were encouraged to speak, and the Vatican began to listen in ways previously unimagined. Lay people, women, and youth were invited into deeper consultation processes, and regional differences were no longer seen as obstacles, but as richness within the universal Church. He paid special attention to the global South, elevating leaders from Asia, Africa, and Latin America to positions of theological and pastoral authority. For Pope Leo XIV, the future of the Church was not centered in one continent, but in the living faith of communities across the world, from the Amazon basin to the villages of sub-Saharan Africa, from refugee camps in the Middle East to the crowded urban parishes of Southeast Asia. Environmental stewardship remained close to his heart. Following in the footsteps of his predecessor, he strengthened the Church's call for ecological responsibility, not merely as a moral obligation, but as a spiritual imperative. His encyclicals spoke of conversion of lifestyle, of solidarity with creation, and of reorienting economies toward the common good rather than endless consumption. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the tone he brought back to the papacy, one of fatherhood. In a world where spiritual authority is often questioned or distrusted, Pope Leo XIV modeled a style of leadership that was firm but gentle, doctrinally faithful but pastorally compassionate. He reminded the Church and the world that holiness is not found in perfection, but in mercy, not in dominance, but in service. He visited war zones and whispered prayers with grieving mothers. He convened peace talks in silence and broke bread with prisoners. He continued to speak in languages not only of words, but of presence. In every encounter, his humanity, simple, sincere, and unshakably rooted in Christ, spoke louder than any decree. Though still living, his legacy was already being written not just in books or media, but in the softened hearts of bishops, the reawakened trust of the faithful, and the renewed courage of the Church to engage with the world without fear. In Pope Leo XIV, the Church did not receive a revolutionary, it received a reconciler, not a man who sought to redefine Catholicism, but one who sought to re-anchor it, firmly, compassionately, and visibly, in the heart of the gospel. History will one day tell the full story of his pontificate, but already the outlines are clear. A pope who came from the people, served among them, and now leads them, not from above, but from beside. A servant of peace, a voice of wisdom, a shepherd in every sense of the word. The pope the world didn't expect, but needed. By the time Pope Leo XIV's pontificate began to settle into rhythm, a quiet truth echoed through the Vatican halls and across the global Church. This was not the pope many had predicted, but precisely the one the Church, and perhaps the world, needed. His background broke many of the old expectations. He was the first American pope, but never the face of American dominance. He came not from the corridors of European ecclesiastical politics, but from the mission fields of Peru. His fluency in multiple languages reflected not only academic brilliance, but an inner conviction that to truly lead the Church, one must first understand its people in their own tongue, their own context, their own wounds. In an era marked by polarization, both within the Church and in the secular world, he refused to be boxed in by ideological camps. Neither conservative nor progressive, Pope Leo XIV's theology was not reactionary or fashionable, but timeless. He spoke from the center of Catholic tradition, and yet allowed that center to stretch its arms wider, to embrace more fully, to listen more deeply. This made him harder to label, and for some, harder to control. But it also made him trustworthy. Bishops who disagreed with his decisions still respected his process. Lay people who had drifted away from the church began to listen again. Religious communities that had long felt ignored found themselves seen and heard. Pope Leo XIV did not seek applause. In fact, he often walked away from it. His visits to countries in crisis were deliberately quiet, focused more on listening than lecturing. He sat with wounded families in silence, without photographers. He wrote letters in his own hand to people who had been forgotten. Missionaries, prisoners, the terminally ill. These gestures, largely unseen by the public, formed the hidden architecture of his papacy. He knew the weight of the church's past, its beauty and its burdens. He did not erase that past, but invited it into conversation with the present. He challenged the church not to run from its wounds, but to tend to them with honesty and grace. Yet he also knew the promise of the future. In young people, he saw not rebellion, but yearning. In secular critics, he saw not enemies, but fellow seekers. In suffering, he saw not punishment, but opportunity, a space where Christ still wept, still healed. This is what made Pope Leo XIV unique. He did not act like a man who had reached the peak of power, but like a man who had descended further into service. He was, in every fiber, a pastor. And in an age of noise, he offered stillness. In an age of spectacle, simplicity. In a time when many leaders chased relevance, he pursued holiness. Perhaps that is why, as his legacy continued to unfold, more and more people from inside the church and far beyond it began to speak not only of what he said or did, but of what they felt in his presence: peace, sincerity, and an invitation to believe again, not just in the church, but in the possibility of goodness. If history remembers him not only as a reformer or a theologian, but as a father to a fractured world, it will be because he chose not to dominate the moment, but to dignify it with silence, with wisdom, and with love. Bạn muốn tôi tiếp tục với phần 9, chẳng hạn như ảnh hưởng lâu dài, hoặc những lời trăn trối cuối cùng tùy theo hướng câu chuyện bạn đang xây dựng.